I drew it out of its sheath and gave the blade a close look. It was Ramsden steel. "I don't need anything that fine," I said, handing it back. "I'll be putting it to everyday use, eating mostly." "Ramsden's fine for everyday use," the tinker said, pushing it back into my hands. "You can use it to trim kindling. Then shave with it if you like. Keeps an edge forever." "I might have to put it to hard use," I clarified. "And Ramsden's brittle." "There is that," the tinker admitted easily. "As my father always used to say, the best knife you'll ever have until it breaks. But the same could be said of any knife. And truth be told, that's the only knife I have." I sighed. I know when I'm being skinned.
That's their fault.
"And a tinderbox?"
But I have to chow.
He held one out almost before I finished saying it. "I couldn't help but notice you got a little ink about the fingers." He gestured at my hands. "I've got some paper here, good quality. Pen and ink, too. Nothing worse than having an idea for a song and not being able to write it down." He held out a leather parcel of paper, pens, and ink. I shook my head, knowing that the mayor's purse would only stretch so far.
Hello?
"I think I'm done with songwriting for a while, Tinker." He shrugged, still holding it out. "Letter writing, then? I know a fellow who had to open a vein once to write a note to his lady love. Dramatic, true. Symbolic, certainly. But also painful, unsanitary, and more than slightly macabre. Now he carries pen and ink with him wherever he goes."
On food.
I felt the color drain from my face as the tinker's words reminded me of something else I'd forgotten in my rush to leave Severin. Denna. All thought of her had been forced out of my mind by the mayor's talk of bandits, 2 bottles of strong wine, and a night with no sleep. I had left without a word after our terrible fight. What would she think if I spoke so cruelly to her, then simply disappeared? I was already a full day's journey from Severin. I couldn't go back just to tell her I was leaving, could I? I considered it for a moment.
And that's
No.
not one app.
Besides, Denna herself had disappeared for days without a word of warning. Surely she would understand if I did the same. Stupid, stupid, stupid. My thoughts spun in circles as I tried to decide among my several unpleasant options. The harsh hee-haw of the tinker's donkey startled a thought into me.
That's not DoorDash.
"Are you headed to Severin, Tinker?" "More through than to," he said, "but yes."
I got my DoorDash here, too.
I just remember a letter I needed to send. "If I gave it to you, could you deliver it to a certain inn?" He nodded slowly.
Hold up.
"I could," he said, "given that you'll be needing paper and ink." He smiled, waving the package again.
They have, like...
I grimaced. "I will, Tinker. But how much will the lot of this cost me?" He looked at the accumulated items. "Salt and box, 4 bits.
Oh, you get the fucking
Knife,
point.
15 bits. Paper, pens, and ink, 18 bits. Tinderbox, 3 bits. And the delivery," I said. "An urgent delivery," the tinker said with a bit of a smile. "To a lady, unless I mistake the look on your face." I nodded. "Right." He rubbed his chin. "Ordinarily, I'd push for about 35, then have a nice leisurely dicker where you bargain me down to 30.
I mean, dude, yeah,
The price was reasonable, especially considering how hard it was to find good paper.
Skip the dishes.
Still, it was a full third of the money the mayor had given me. We would need that money for food, lodging, and other supplies. But before I could say anything, the tinker continued. "Now I can tell that's too much for your comfort," he said. "And I hope you don't think me too forward in saying this, but that is a rather fine cloak you are wearing. I'm always willing to make a fellow a trade." I pulled my lovely burgundy cloak around me self-consciously. "I suppose I'd be willing to give it up," I said, not having to fake the regret in my voice. "But that will leave me with no cloak at all. What will I do when it rains?" "No trouble there," the tinker said. He pulled a bundle of cloth out of a pack and held it up for me to see. It had been black once upon a time, but long use and many washings had faded it to a dark greenish color. "It's a little tatty," I said, reaching out to finger a fraying seam. "It's just broken in, that's all," he said easily, spreading it across my shoulders. "Good fit. Good color for you, brings out your eyes. Besides, you don't want to be looking too well off, what with those bandits on the road." I sighed. "What will you give me in trade?" I asked, handing my beautiful cloak over to him. That cloak's not a month old, mind you, and it's never even seen a drop of rain. The tinker ran his hands over my beautiful cloak. "It's got all sorts of little pockets," he said admiringly. "That's just lovely." I fingered the thinning cloth of the tinker's cloak. "If you'll throw in needle and thread, I'll trade you my cloak for the lot of it," I said with sudden inspiration. "Plus, I'll give you an iron penny, a copper penny, and a silver penny." I grinned. It was a pittance. But that's what tinkers in stories ask for when they trade some fabulous piece of magic to an unsuspecting widow's son when he's off to make his fortune in the world. The tinker threw his head back and laughed. "I was about to suggest that very thing," he said. Then he tossed my cloak over his arm and shook my hand firmly.
Thanks so much for the 4 months.
I fished around in my purse and handed over an iron drab, 2 vintage halfpennies, and, much to my pleasant surprise, an Aturan hard penny. The last was lucky for me, as it was only worth a fraction of a vintage silver round. I emptied the dozen pockets of my burgundy cloak into my travel sack and collected my new possessions from the tinker. Then I wrote a quick letter to Denna, explaining that my patron had sent me away unexpectedly. I apologized for the rash things I'd said, and told her I would meet with her as soon as I was back in Severin. I would have liked more time to compose it. I would have liked to give a more subtle apology, a more detailed explanation, but the tinker had finished packing away my beautiful cloak and was obviously eager to be on his way again. Not having any sealing wax to secure the letter, I used a trick I'd invented while writing notes on the mayor's behalf. I folded the piece of paper against itself, then tucked it together in such a way that it would be necessary to tear the paper in order to unfold it again. I handed it to the tinker. "It goes to a pretty dark-haired woman by the name of Denna. She's staying at the Four Tapers in Severin Low." "That reminds me," he exclaimed as he tucked my letter into a pocket. "Candles!"
Pretty good.
He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a handful of fat tallow tapers. "Everyone needs candles." Funny thing was, I could use some, though not for the reasons he thought. "I've also got some rubbing wax for your boots," he continued, rooting through his bundles. "We get fierce rain this time of year." I held up my hands, laughing. "I'll give you a bit for 4 candles, but I can't afford any more. If this keeps up, I'll have to buy your donkey just to carry the lot with me." "Suit yourself," he said with an easy shrug. "Pleasure doing business with you, young sir." Chapter 76. Tinder. The sun was starting to set by the time we found a good place to camp on the second night. Dedan went foraging for firewood. Martin began cutting up carrots and potatoes and sent Hespa to fill the cookpot with water. I used Martin's small spade to dig a pit for our fire. Without being asked, Tempe picked up a branch and used his sword to shave thin strips of dry wood to use for tinder. Unsheathed, his sword still didn't seem terribly impressive, but given how easily it was peeling away paper-thin strips of wood, it must have been sharp as a shaving razor. I finished lining the pit with stones. Wordlessly, Tempe handed me a handful of tinder. I nodded. "Would you like to use my knife?" I asked, hoping to draw him into a bit of a conversation. I'd barely shared a dozen words with him in the last 2 days. Tempe's pale gray eyes looked at the knife on my belt, then back at his sword. He shook his head, fidgeting nervously.
Dude, look at how close together they are.
"Isn't it bad for the edge?" I asked. The mercenary shrugged, avoiding my eye. I began to lay the fire, and that was when I made my first mistake. As I've said, there was a chill in the air, and we were all of us tired. So rather than spend half an hour slowly nursing a spark into a decent campfire, I arranged twigs around Tempe's tinder, then stacked progressively bigger sticks around it, making a tightly packed cluster of wood. Dedan returned with another armload of firewood just as I was finishing. "Lovely," he groused, quiet enough he could pretend he was just talking to himself, but loud enough so everyone could hear. And you're in charge. Wonderful. What's stuck in your teeth now? Martin asked, tiredly. Boy's making a little wooden fort, not a fire. Dedan sighed dramatically, then assumed a tone he probably thought was fatherly, but came across as profoundly condescending.
All the wall hacks right now.
Here, I'll help you out. A spark will never catch on that. Do you have flint and steel? I'll show you how to use them. No one enjoys being talked down to, but I have a particular aversion to it. Dedan had been making it clear for 2 days that he thought I was an idiot. I gave a tired sigh, my oldest, most world-weary sigh. That was how I needed to play it. He thought of me as young and useless. I needed to drive home the point that I was nothing of the sort. Dedan, I asked, what do you know about me? He gave me a blank look. You know one thing about me, I said calmly. You know the mayor put me in charge. I looked him in the eye. Is the mayor an idiot? Dedan made a dismissive gesture. Of course not. I was just saying. I stood up and regretted it, as it just brought into sharp contrast how much taller he was. Would the mayor have put me in charge if I were an idiot? He gave an insincere smile, trying to pass off 2 days' worth of derogatory muttering as some sort of misunderstanding. Now, don't get all twisted up over... I held up my hand.
How many times did I knock
This isn't
them?
your fault. You just don't know anything about me. But let's not waste time on it tonight. We're all tired. For now, rest assured that I'm not some rich tit's son out for a lark. I pinched a thin piece of Tempe's tinder between my fingers and concentrated. I pulled more heat than I needed and felt my arm go chilly all the way to the shoulder. And rest assured, I know how to start a fire. The shaved pieces of wood caught fire, flaring up hot and sudden, catching the rest of the tinder and making flames leap up almost instantly. I'd meant it to be a dramatic gesture so Dedan would stop thinking of me as some useless boy. But the time I spent at the university had made me jaded. Starting a fire like this was as simple as putting on your boots for a member of the Arcanum. Dedan, on the other hand, had never met an Arcanist, and probably hadn't ever been within 500 miles of the university. Everything he knew about magic was from campfire stories. So when the fire flared up, he went pale as a sheet and took several sudden steps back. He looked for all the world as if I'd suddenly called up a roaring sheet of fire like Taborlin the Great.
I've always been a little iffy with the R9s.
I saw Martin and Hespa wearing the same expression,
R9 is never like what
native vintage superstition written clearly on their faces. Their eyes went to the flickering fire, then back to me. I was one of those. I meddled with dark powers. I summoned demons. I ate the entire little cheese, including the rind. Looking at their stunned faces, I realized nothing I said would set them at ease. Not right now. So instead, I sighed and began to set up my sleeping roll for the night. While there wasn't much cheerful conversation around the fire that night, there wasn't any muttering from Dedan either. I'd like respect. But failing that, a little healthy fear can go a long way to making things run smoothly. 2 days with no further dramatics on my part helped everyone relax. Dedan was still all bluff and bravado, but he had quit calling me boy and was only complaining about half as much, so I considered it a victory.
Way too fucking coordinated.
Flushed with this lukewarm success, I decided to make an active attempt to draw Tempe into a conversation. If I was going to be in charge of this little group, I needed to know more about him. Most importantly, I needed to know if he could speak more than 5 words in a row. So, I approached the Adem mercenary when we stopped for our midday meal. He was sitting slightly apart from the rest of us. He wasn't standoffish. It's just that the rest of us would sit and talk while we ate. Tempe, on the other hand, simply ate. But today, I made a point of sitting down next to him with my lunch, a chunk of hard sausage and some cold potatoes. "Hello, Tempe." He looked up and nodded. For a second, I caught a glimpse of his pale gray eyes. Then he looked away, shifting restlessly. He ran his hand through his hair, and for a second he reminded me of Simon. They both had the same slender build and sandy hair. Simon wasn't this quiet, though. Sometimes I could barely get a word in edgewise with Sim. I tried to talk to Tempe before, of course. Ordinary small talk, the weather, sore feet after a long day's walk, the food. These had all come to nothing. At best, a word or two. More often, a nod or a shrug. But most common was a blank look followed by fidgeting and a stubborn refusal to do so much as look me in the eye. So today, I had a conversational gambit. I have heard stories about the Lethani, I said. I would like to know more.
They're 3-stacking.
Would you tell me about it?
That was their first kills.
Tempe's pale eyes touched mine briefly, his expression still blank. Then he looked away again. He tugged one of the red leather straps that held his shirt close to his body and fidgeted with his sleeve.
I was about to
No,
1v3 these guys.
I will not speak on Lethani. It is not for you. Do not ask. He looked away from me again, down at the ground. I counted in my head. 16 words. That answered one of my questions, at least.
Oh, my food.
Chapter 77. Pennyworth. Twilight was settling in as we rounded a curve in the road. I heard clapping and stomping mingled with music, shouting, and roars of laughter. After 10 hours of walking, the sound lifted my spirits to an almost cheerful level. Located at the last major crossroad south of the Eld, the Pennyworth Inn was enormous. Built of rough-hewn timber, it had 2 full stories and a scattering of gables that hinted at a smaller 3rd floor above that. Through the windows I caught glimpses of men and women dancing while an unseen fiddler sawed out a mad and breathless tune. Dedan took a deep breath. "Can you smell that? I tell ya, there's a woman in this place could cook a stone and make me beg for more. Sweet Peg. By these hands, I hope she's still around."
Thanks, Fracture.
He made a curving gesture, showing me the double meaning of his words as he nudged Martin with an elbow. Hespa's eyes narrowed as she stared at the back of Dedan's head. Oblivious, Dedan continued. "Tonight, I'll sleep with a belly full of lamb and brandy, although a little less sleeping might prove a little more entertaining, if my last trip here was any indication." I saw the storm brewing on Hespa's face and spoke up quickly. "Whatever's in the pot and a bunk for each of us," I said firmly. "Anything else comes out of your own pocket." Dedan looked as if he couldn't quite believe his ears. "Come off it! We've been sleeping rough for days. Besides, 'tain't your money. Don't be a stingy shim with it." "We haven't done our job yet," I said calmly. "Not even a piece of it. I don't know how long we may be out here, but I know I'm not rich. If we run through the mayor's purse too quickly, we're going to have to hunt for what we eat." I looked around at everyone. "Unless someone else has enough coin to keep us fed and cares to share." Martin smiled ruefully at the suggestion. Hespa's eyes were for Dedan, who continued glowering in my direction. Tempe fidgeted, his expression unreadable as ever. Avoiding my eyes, he glanced at everyone in turn, his expression blank. His eyes moved not from face to face, but at Dedan's hands, then Dedan's feet, then Martin's feet, then Hespa's, then mine. He shifted his weight and moved a half-step closer to Dedan. Hoping to dispel the tension, I softened my tone and said, "After everything is done, we'll split what's left of the purse. That way each of us will have a little extra in our pocket before we even get back to Severin. We can each spend our lots as we want to. Then." I could tell Dedan wasn't pleased and waited to see if he would press the point. Instead, it was Martin who spoke up. "After a day of long walking," he said in a musing voice, as if talking to himself, "a drink would go down nice." Dedan looked to his friend, then back to me expectantly. "I think the purse can stand a round of drinks," I conceded with a smile. I don't think the mayor is trying to make priests of us. Do you?" This got a throaty laugh from Hespa, while Martin and Dedan cracked smiles. Tempe glanced at me with his pale eyes, fidgeted, and looked away. A few minutes of relaxed haggling got the 5 of us common bunks, a simple supper, and a round of drinks for a single silver bit. After that was done, I found a table in a quieter corner of the room and tucked my loot out of harm's way under my bench. Then I sat down, bone-weary and wondering what I could do to get Dedan to stop acting like such a little swaggercock. Such was the distracted turning of my thoughts when my dinner thumped onto the table in front of me. I looked up to see a woman's face and well-advertised bosom framed by a tumble of bright red curls. Her skin was white as cream with just the barest hint of freckle, her lips a pale, dangerous pink, her eyes a bright, dangerous green. "Thank you," I said, somewhat belatedly.
I hate that gun so
"You're
much.
welcome,
He was
love."
literally doing circles.
She
He
smiled
didn't even
playfully
know
with
who
her
he was
eyes
shooting.
and brushed her hair back from her bare shoulder. "It looked like you were almost asleeping in your
He
seat."
didn't even know he was shooting, my guy.
I nearly was. A long day and a long road. "That's a shame indeed," she said with playful
3
regret
bullets?
as she rubbed the back of her neck. "If I thought you'd still be on your feet in an hour, I'd take you off them."
He still doesn't even
She
know
reached
who he's
out
shooting.
and twined her fingers lightly through the hair on the back of my head. "The 2 of us would be enough to start a fire." I froze like a startled deer. I cannot say why, except perhaps that I was tired from several days on the road. Perhaps it was that I'd never been approached in such a forthright manner before. Perhaps
from the nether regions.
Perhaps
Just
I
to
was
make you
young
mad, I swear.
and woefully inexperienced. Let us leave it at that. I scrambled desperately for something to say, but by the time I found my tongue, she'd taken a half step away and given me a shrewd look. I felt my face grow hot, embarrassing me further. Without thinking, I looked down at the table and the dinner she'd brought.
I died to that?
Potato soup, I thought numbly. She gave a small, quiet laugh and touched my shoulder kindly.
That they have
"I'm
bots on
sorry,
here that
lad.
just are
You look like
that-
you were a little
fucking-
more—" She broke off, as if reconsidering her words, then started again. "I like the fresh look of you, but I didn't think you were that young." Though she spoke gently, I could hear the smile in her voice. It made my face burn even hotter, all the way to my ears. Finally, seeming to realize that anything she said would just embarrass me further, she took her hand off my shoulder. "I'll be back to see if you need anything later." I nodded dumbly and watched her go. Her retreat was pleasing, but I was distracted by the sounds of scattered laughter. I looked around to see amusement on the faces of the men sitting at the long tables around me. One group raised their mugs in a silent, mocking salute. Another fellow leaned over to pat my back consolingly, saying, "Don't take it personal, boy. She's turned all of us away."
I'm curious. Yo,
Feeling as if everyone in the room was watching me,
Let me
I kept my eyes low and began to eat my dinner. As I tore off pieces of bread and dipped them in my soup, I composed a mental catalog of the extent of my idiocy.
I'm gonna go to both.
Surreptitiously, I watched the red-haired serving girl entertain and rebuff the ploys of a dozen men as she carried drinks from table to table. I had regained a bit of my composure by the time Martin slid into a chair next to me. "You did a good job with Dedan out there," he said without preamble. My spirits lifted a bit. "Did I?" Martin nodded slightly as his sharp eyes wandered over the crowd that filled the room. "Most folk try to bully him, make him feel stupid. He'd have paid you back 10 times the trouble if you'd done it that way." "He was being stupid," I pointed out. "And when you come right down to it, I did bully him." It was his turn to shrug. "But you did it smart, so he'll still listen to you." He took a drink and paused, changing the subject. "Hespa offered to share a room with him tonight," he said casually. "Really?" I said, more than slightly surprised. "She's getting bolder." He gave a slow nod. "And?" I prompted. And nothing. Dedan said he'd be damned before he spent money on a room he should have for free. He slid his eyes to me and raised an eyebrow. You're not serious, I said flatly. He has to know. He's just playing the simpleton because he doesn't like her. I don't think so, Martin said, turning toward me and lowering his voice a bit. 3 span ago, we finished a caravan job from Raelian. It was a long haul, and Dedan and me had a pocket full of coin and nothing in particular to do with it. So, by the end of the night, we're sitting in this grubby little dockside tavern, too drunk to stand up and leave, and he starts talking about her. Martin shook his head slowly. He went on for an hour, and you wouldn't have recognized the woman he was describing as our hard-eyed Hespa. He practically sang about her. He sighed. He thinks she's too good for him, and he's convinced if he so much as looked at her sideways, he'd end up with his arm broken in 3 places. Why didn't you tell him? Tell him what? That was before she started going all cow-eyed over him. I thought his worries were fairly sensible at the time. What do you think Hespa would do to you if you were to give her a friendly pat on any of her friendlier parts? I looked over to where Hespa stood at the bar. 1 foot tapped roughly in time to the rhythm of the fiddle. Other than that, the set of her shoulders, her eyes, the line of her jaw were all hard, almost belligerent. There was a small but noticeable gap between her and the men standing on either side of her at the bar. I probably wouldn't risk my arm either, I admitted. But he has to know by now. He isn't blind. He's no worse off than the rest of us. I started to protest, then glanced at the red-haired serving girl. We could tell him, I said. You could. He trusts you. Martin sucked at his teeth with his tongue. Nah, he said, setting his drink down firmly. It would just make things muddier. Either he'll see it, or he won't. In his own time, in his own way. He shrugged. Or not, and the sun will still rise in the morning. Neither of us spoke for a long while. Martin watched the buzzing room over the top of his mug, his eyes growing distant. I let the noise of the place fade to a low, comforting purr as I leaned against the wall, drowsing. And as my thoughts untended tend to do, they wandered to Denna. I thought about the smell of her, the arch of her neck near her ear, the way her hands moved when she talked. I wondered where she was tonight, if she was well. I wondered just a bit if her thoughts ever wandered into warm musings of me. Hunting bandits shouldn't be hard. Besides, it'll be nice to get the jump on them for a change. Lawless, damn rabble bastards. The words drew me out of my warm drowse like a fish yanked from a pool. The fiddler had stopped playing to have a drink, and in the relative quiet of the room, Dedan's voice was loud as a donkey's bray. I opened my eyes and saw Martin was looking around in mild alarm too, no doubt roused by the same words that had caught my ear. It only took me a second to spot Dedan. He was sitting 2 tables away having a drunken conversation with a gray-haired farmer. Martin was already getting to his feet. Not wanting to draw attention to the situation, I hissed, "Get him!" and forced myself back into my seat. I gritted my teeth as Martin threaded quickly through the tables, tapped Dedan on the shoulder, and jerked a thumb toward the table where I sat. Dedan grumbled something I'm glad I didn't hear, and grudgingly pushed himself to his feet. I forced my eyes to wander around the room rather than follow Dedan. Tempe was easy to spot in his mercenary reds. He was facing the hearth, watching the fiddler tune his instrument. There were several empty glasses on the table in front of him, and he had loosened the leather straps of his shirt. He eyed the fiddler with a strange intensity. As I watched, a serving girl brought him another drink. He looked her over, his pale eyes moving pointedly up and down her body. She said something, and he kissed the back of her hand as smoothly as a courtier. She blushed and pushed at his shoulder playfully. One of his hands moved smoothly to the curve of her waist and rested there. She didn't seem to mind. Dedan stepped close to my table, eclipsing my view of Tempe just as the fiddler lifted his bow and began to saw out a jig. A dozen people came to their feet, eager to dance. "What?" Dedan demanded as he came to stand in front of my table.
"That was you?
"Have ye called me over here to tell me it's getting late? That I've got a busy day tomorrow and I should tuck my little self into bed?" He leaned forward under the table, putting his eyes more on level with mine. I caught a sour smell on his breath. Dreg. A cheap, repulsive liquor that you can start fires with. I laughed dismissively.
The whole gang.
"Hell, I'm not your mum." Actually, I had been about to say that very thing and scrambled mentally for something else to distract him with. My eye lighted on the redhead that had served me my dinner earlier that evening, and I leaned forward in my seat. "I was wondering if you could tell me something," I said in my best conspiratorial tone. His scowl gave way to curiosity, and I lowered my voice a little more. "You've been here before, right?" He nodded, leaning a little closer. "Do you know what that girl's name is?" I nodded my head in the redhead's direction. Dedan took an over-careful look over his shoulder that surely would have drawn her attention if she hadn't been facing away from us. "The blonde one the Adam's pawing at?" Dedan asked. Redhead. Dedan's broad forehead wrinkled as he squinted the far side of the room into focus. "Lucy?" he asked softly. He turned to me, still squinting. "Little Lucy?" I shrugged and began to regret my choice of diversionary tactic. An explosive laugh burst out of the big man, and he half fell, half slid onto the bench across from me. "Lucy?" He chuckled a little more loudly than I liked. "Quoth, I had you all wrong." He slapped the table with the flat of his hand and laughed again, nearly tipping himself over backward on the bench. "Ah, you've got a good eye, boy, but you haven't got a damn chance."
Don't worry about it. Don't worry. He's not talking.
My battered pride pricked up at this. "Why not? Isn't she, well..."
No way that guy's...
I trailed off,
right?
making an inarticulate gesture. He somehow managed to gather my meaning. "Aho?" he asked incredulously. "God, boy, no! There's a couple around." He made a sweeping gesture over his head, then lowered his voice to a more private level. "Not really whores, mind you. Just girls who don't mind a little extra at night." He paused, blinked. "Money. Extra money. And extra other things," he chortled. "I just thought..." I began weakly. "Aye, any man who ever had eyes and balls thought that." He leaned a little closer. "She's a lusty little one. She'll trip a man who catches her eye, but she can't be talked or bought into bed. If she could, she'd be rich as a king of Vint." He looked in her direction. "How much is a roll with that worth?" "I'd give..." He squinted in her direction, his lips moving as if going through some silent, complex arithmetic. After a moment, he shrugged. "More than I've got." He looked back to me, shrugged again. "Still, it's no good wishing. Save yourself the trouble. If you want, I know a lady here who's no shame to look at. Might be willing to brighten up your evening." He started to look around the room. "No." I put my hand on his arm to stop him. "I was just curious, that's all." I sounded insincere, and I knew it. "Thanks for filling me in." "Nothing to it."
4 minutes.
He carefully got to his feet. "Oh," I said, as if a thought had just occurred to me. "Could you do me a favor?" He nodded, and I gestured him closer. "I'm worried Hespa might end up talking about our job for the mayor. If the bandits here were hunting them, things will get 10 times harder." A guilty look flashed across his face. "I'm pretty sure she wouldn't mention it, but you know how women like to talk." "I understand," he said quickly as he stood up. "I'll talk to her. Better to be careful. The hawk-faced fiddler finished his jig, and everyone clapped and stomped and pounded empty mugs on their tables. I sighed and rubbed my face into my hands. When I looked up, I saw Martin at the table next to mine. He touched his fingers to his forehead and nodded a small salute. I gave a slight, seated bow. It was always nice to have an appreciative audience. Chapter 78. Another Road, Another Forest. I took a certain dark pleasure in seeing a rather hung-over Dedan on the road before the sun was fully in the sky the next morning. The large man carried himself delicately, but, to give him due credit, he didn't offer a word of complaint, unless the occasional low moan can be counted as a word.
Dude,
now that I was watching more closely, I spotted the marks of infatuation on Dedan. The way he said Hespa's name, the coarse jokes he made when talking to her. Every few minutes, he would find an excuse to glance in her direction, always under some pretext, a stretch, an idle glance at the road, a gesture to the trees around us. Despite this, Dedan remained oblivious to the sporadic courtship Hespa was paying him in return. At times, it was amusing to watch, like a well-orchestrated Modegan tragedy. At times, I wanted to strangle them both. Tempe traveled wordlessly among us like a mute, well-behaved puppy. He watched everything, the trees, the road, the clouds. If it weren't for the unquestionably intelligent look in his eyes, I'd have thought him a simpleton by this point. The few questions I put to him were still met with awkward fidgeting nods, shrugs, or shakes of the head. All the while my curiosity nagged at me. I knew the Lethani was just a piece of storybook nonsense, but part of me couldn't help but wonder. Was he really saving his words? Could he really use his quiet like armor? Move fast as a snake? The truth was, after catching glimpses of what Alxa-Dal and Fela could do by calling on the names of fire and stone, the thought of someone storing up words to burn as fuel didn't seem nearly as foolish as it used to. The five of us got to know each other in dribs and drabs, growing familiar with each other's quirks. Dedan carefully groomed the ground where he lay his bedroll, not just removing twigs and stones, but stomping flat every tuft of grass or lump of dirt. Hespa whistled tunelessly when she thought no one was listening and picked her teeth methodically after every meal. Martin wouldn't eat meat that had the barest bit of pink to it or drink water that hadn't been boiled or mixed with wine. He told the rest of us at least twice a day that we were fools for not doing the same. But in terms of odd behavior, Tempe was the prize winner of the lot. He wouldn't look me in the eye, didn't smile, didn't frown, didn't speak. Since we left the Pennyworth, he had made only one comment of his own free will. Rain would make this road another road, this forest another forest. He said each word distinctly, as if he had been deliberating on the statement all day. For all I knew, he had. He washed himself obsessively.
Yes.
The rest of us would take advantage of a bathhouse when we stopped at an inn, but Tempe bathed every day. If there was a stream handy, he would bathe both at night and then again when he woke. Otherwise, he would wash himself using a cloth and some of his drinking water. And twice a day, without fail, he performed an elaborate ritual stretch, his hands making careful shapes and patterns in the air. It reminded me of the slow court dances they perform in Modeg. It obviously kept him limber, but it was strange to watch. Hespa made jokes about how if the bandits asked us to dance, our sweet-smelling mercenary would be a wonderful help, but she said it quietly when Tempe was out of earshot. In terms of quirks, I suppose I was in no position to throw stones. I played my lute most evenings, when I wasn't too weary from walking. I dare say it didn't improve the other's opinion of me as a tactical leader or arcanist. As we neared our destination, I grew increasingly anxious. Martin was the only one of us truly suited to this work. Dedan and Hespa would be good in a fight, but they were troublesome to work with. Dedan was argumentative and stubborn. Hespa was lazy. She rarely helped prepare meals or clean up afterward unless she was asked, and even then her help was so grudging it was barely any help at all. And then there was Tempe, a hired killer who wouldn't look me in the eye or hold a conversation, a mercenary I firmly believed could look forward to a decent career in the Modegan Theater.
Green shirt. That's it.
5 days after leaving Severin, we came to the area where the attacks had been made. A 20-mile stretch of twisting road that ran through the Eld. No towns, no inns, not even an abandoned farm. An utterly isolated stretch of the King's Highway in the middle of an endless ancient wood. The natural habitat of bears, mad hermits, and poachers. A highwayman's paradise. Martin went scouting while the rest of us set up camp. An hour later, he emerged from the trees, winded but in good spirits. He reassured us he hadn't found sign of anyone else nearby.
He's not cold.
I can't believe I'm defending tax collectors, Dedan muttered disgustedly. Hespa gave a throaty laugh. You're defending civilization, I corrected, and you're keeping the roads safe. Besides, Mayor Alvaron does important things with those taxes. I grinned. Like pay us. That's what I'm fighting for, Martin said. After dinner, I outlined the only strategy I'd been able to come up with in 5 long days of thinking. I drew a curving line on the ground with a stick. Okay. Here's the road, about 20 miles of it.
Oh, that's fucking cold.
Miles? The soft voice was Tempe's. Excuse me? I asked. This was the first thing I had heard him say in a day and a half. Meals.
I'm still gonna fucking eat it, though, let's be real.
His accent was so thick around the unfamiliar word that it took me a second to understand he was saying miles.
Those are good.
Miles, I said distinctly. I pointed in the direction of the road and held up one finger. From here to the road is 1 mile. Today we walked 15 miles. He nodded once. I turned back to my drawing. It's safe to assume the bandits are within 10 miles of the road. I drew a box around my crude sketch of the road.
That's a bad idea.
That gives us 400 square miles of forest to search. There was a moment of silence as everyone absorbed that piece of information. Finally, Tempe spoke. That is large. I nodded seriously. It would take us months to search that much territory, but we shouldn't have to. I added a couple more lines to my drawing. Every day, Martin will scout ahead for us. I looked up to him. How much ground can you safely cover in a day? He thought for a second, looking around at the trees surrounding us. This forest, with this much underscrub, about a square mile. How many if you're being careful? He smiled. I'm always careful. I nodded and drew a line parallel to the road. Martin will scout a strip about a half-mile wide, about a mile back from the road. He'll keep an eye out for their camp or their sentries, so the rest of us don't stumble into them accidentally. Hespa shook her head. That's no good. They won't be that close to the road. If they're looking to stay hid, they'll be farther back, at least 2 or 3 miles. Dedan nodded.
You leave a tip?
I'd make sure I was at least 4 miles from the road before I hunkered down and made a habit of killing folk. I think so too, I agreed. But they have to make their way to the road sooner or later. They have to post lookouts and travel back and forth for ambushes. They need to reprovision themselves. Since they've been here several months, odds are they've worn some sort of trail. I added a little detail to my dirt map with my stick. After Martin is scouted, 2 of us will go in and make a careful search behind him. We'll cover a thin strip of forest, searching it for any sign of their trail. The other 2 will keep an eye on the camp. We can cover about 2 miles a day. We'll start on the north side of the road and search from west to east. If we don't find a trail, we'll cross to the south side of the road and work our way back from east to west. I finished drawing in the dirt and stood back. We'll find their trail in a span of days. Maybe 2, depending on our luck. I leaned back and drove my stick into the ground. Dedan stared bleakly at the rough map. We'll need more supplies. I nodded. We'll move camp every 5th day. 2 of us will walk back to Crossan to get supplies. The other 2 will move the camp. Martin will rest. Martin spoke up. We'll have to be careful with our fires from now on, too, he said. The smell of smoke will give us away if we're upwind of them. I nodded. We'll need a fire pit every night, and we'll want to keep an eye out for rennel trees. I looked at Martin. You know what a rennel looks like, don't you? His expression was surprised. Hespa looked back and forth between us. What's rennel? She asked. It's a tree, Martin said. Good for firewood. It burns clean and hot. No smoke to speak of, and hardly any stink of smoke either. Even when the wood is green, I said. Same with the leaves. It's useful stuff. It doesn't grow everywhere, but I've seen some around. How does a city boy like you know something like that? Dedan asked. Knowing things is what I do, I said seriously. And what in the world makes you think I grew up in a city? Dedan shrugged, looking away. That should be the only wood we burn from here on out, I said. If it's in short supply, we'll save it for a cook fire. If we don't have any, we'll have to eat cold, so keep an eye out.
Without jitter aiming?
Everyone nodded, Tempe slightly later than the rest. Lastly, we'd better have our story straight in case they stumble onto us while we're looking for them. I pointed to Martin. What are you going to say if someone catches you while you're out scouting? He looked surprised, but hardly hesitated in his response. I'm a poacher. He pointed to his unstrung bow leaning against a tree. It won't be far from the truth. And you're from? There was a flicker of hesitation. Crossan, just a day west of here. And your name is? Maris, he said awkwardly. Dedan laughed. I cracked a smile. Don't lie about your name. It's hard to do convincingly. If they catch you and let you go, fine. Just don't lead them back to our camp. If they want to take you back with them, make the best of it. Pretend you'd like to join up. Don't try to run. Martin looked uneasy.
How are these fries hot?
I'd just stay with them? I nodded. They'll expect you to run on the first night if they think you're stupid. If they think you're clever, they'll expect you to run on the second night. But by the third night, they should trust you a bit. Wait until midnight, then start some sort of disturbance. Light a couple of tents on fire or something. We'll be waiting for the confusion and take them apart from the outside.
No way.
I looked around at the other 3. The plan is the same for any of you. Wait until the third night. How will you find their camp? Martin asked, a thin layer of sweat on his forehead. I didn't blame him. This was a dangerous game we were playing. If they catch me, I won't be there to help track you down. I won't be finding them, I said. I'll be finding you.
That's a possibility.
I can find any of you in the forest. I looked around the fire, expecting at least a grumble from Dedan, but none of them seemed to doubt my arcane abilities. Idly, I wondered how much they thought I was capable of. The truth was, I'd surreptitiously collected a hair from each of them in the last few days, so I could easily create a makeshift dowsing pendulum for anyone in the group in less than a minute. Given vintage superstition, I doubted they'd be happy knowing the specific details. What should our stories be? Hespa tapped Dedan on the chest with the back of her hand, her knuckles making a hollow noise on his hard leather vest. Do you think you could convince them you were disgruntled caravan guards who had decided to turn bandit? Dedan snorted. Hell, I've thought about it once or twice. At a look from Hespa, he snorted. Don't tell me you haven't done the same. Span after span of walking in the rain, eating beans, sleeping on the ground, all for a penny a day? He shrugged. God's teeth, I'm surprised half of us don't take to the trees. I smiled. You'll do just fine. What about him? Hespa jerked her thumb at Tempe. Nobody is going to believe he's gone wild. Adem make 10 times what we do for a day's work.
Where are my teammates, man?
20 times, Daydan grumbled. I'd been thinking the same thing. Tempe, what will you do if you are found by the bandits? Tempe fidgeted a little, but didn't say anything. He looked at me briefly, then broke eye contact, glancing down and to the side. I couldn't tell if he was thinking or merely confused. If it weren't for his Adem Reds, he wouldn't look like anything special, Martin said. Even the sword doesn't look like much. Doesn't look like 20 times as much as me, that's for sure. Daydan's voice was low, but not so low that everyone couldn't hear. I was worried about Tempe's outfit too. I'd tried to draw the Adem into a conversation several times with the hope of discussing the problem with him, but it was like trying to have a chat with a cat. But the fact that he hadn't known the word miles made me realize something I should have thought of long before. Aturan wasn't his native language. Having recently struggled to make myself fluent in Siaru at the university, I could understand the impulse to keep quiet rather than speak and make a fool of myself. He could try to play along, same as us, Hespa said dubiously. It's hard to lie convincingly when you're not good with the language, I said. Tempe's pale eyes darted to each of us as we spoke, but he didn't offer any comment. Folk underestimate a person who can't speak well, Hespa said. Maybe he could sort of just play dumb? Act confused, like he was lost. Wouldn't have to play dumb, Daydan continued under his breath. Could just be dumb.
If I'm bad,
Tempe looked at Daydan, still expressionless, but with more intensity than before. He drew a slow, deliberate breath before speaking. Quiet is not stupid, he said, his voice flat. You always talk. Check, 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 check. He made a motion with one hand, like a mouth opening and closing. Always. Like dog all night barking at tree. Try to be big. No, just noise. Just dog. I shouldn't have laughed, but it caught me completely off guard, partly because I thought of Tempe as so quiet and passive, and partly because he was absolutely right. If Daydan were a dog, he would be a dog that barked endlessly at nothing, barking just to hear himself bark. Still, I shouldn't have laughed, but I did. Hespa laughed too and tried to hide it, which was worse. Daydan's face went dark with anger, and he got to his feet. You come here and say that. Still expressionless, Tempe stood and walked around the fire until he stood next to Daydan. Well, if I say he stood next to him, you will take the wrong impression. Most people stand 2 or 3 feet away when talking to you, but Tempe walked until he was less than a foot away from Daydan. To get any closer, he would have had to give him a hug or climb him. I could lie and say this happened too quickly for me to intervene, but that wouldn't be true. The simple truth was that I couldn't think of an easy way to break up the situation, but the more complicated truth was that I was pretty fed up with Daydan myself by this point. What's more, this was the most I'd ever heard Tempe speak. For the first time since I'd met him, he was behaving like a person, not just some mute ambulatory doll. And I was curious to see him fight. I'd heard a lot about the legendary Adem prowess, and I was hoping to see it thump some of the sullen mutter out of Daydan's thick head. Tempe walked up to Daydan, standing close enough to put his arms around him. Daydan stood a full head taller, broader across the shoulders, and thicker in the chest. Tempe looked up at him without a trace of anything you might expect to see on his face. No bravado, no mocking smile, nothing. Just dog, Tempe said softly with no particular inflection. Big noise dog. He lifted up his hand and made a mouth of it again. Check, check, Check. Dedan lifted a hand and shoved hard against Tempe's chest. I'd seen this sort of thing countless times in the taverns near the university. It was the sort of shove that sends a man staggering backward, off balance, and prone to stagger and trip. Except Tempe didn't stagger. He just stepped away. Then he reached out casually and cuffed Dedan along one side of his head, the way a parent might swat an unruly child in the market. It wasn't even hard enough to move Dedan's head, but we could all hear a soft paff sound, and Dedan's hair puffed out like a milkweed pod someone had blown against. Dedan stood still for a moment, as if he couldn't quite understand what had happened. Then he frowned and brought both hands up to give Tempe a more violent shove. Tempe stepped away from this, too, then swatted Dedan on the other side of his head. Dedan scowled, grunted, and brought his hands up making fists. He was a big man, and his mercenary leathers creaked and strained at the shoulders as he lifted his arms. He waited a moment, obviously hoping Tempe would make the first move. Then he stomped forward, drew his arm back, and threw a punch, hard and heavy as a farmhand swinging an axe. Tempe saw it coming and stepped away a third time, but halfway through his clumsy swing, everything about Dedan changed. He raised himself up on the balls of his feet, and his ponderous haymaker punch evaporated. Suddenly, he no longer looked like a lumbering bull, and instead, he darted forward and snapped out 3 quick punches, fast as a bird's wing flapping. Tempe sidestepped one, slapped the other aside, but the third caught him high on the shoulder, spinning him partway around and knocking him backward. He took 2 quick steps out of Dedan's reach, regained his balance, and shook himself slightly. Then he laughed, high and delighted. The sound softened the expression on Dedan's face, and he grinned in return, though he didn't lower his hands or move off the balls of his feet. Despite this, Tempe stepped up, avoided another jab, and struck Dedan in the face with the flat of his hand. Not across the cheek, as if they were squabbling lovers on stage. Tempe's hand came down from above and struck Dedan across the front of his face, from his forehead down to his chin. "Ah!" Dedan shouted.
Good one.
"Black damn!" He staggered away, clutching at his nose. "What's wrong with you? Did you just slap me?"
I didn't have this cup.
He peered out at Tempe from behind his hand. "You fight like a woman!" For a moment, Tempe looked as if he might object.
Like, wait, how did you know I had McDonald's?
Then he gave the first smile I had ever seen from him and gave a small nod and a shrug instead.
You guys don't have this cup.
"Yes. I fight
Canadian
like a
version
woman."
of McDonald's. Fuck you, Americans.
Dedan hesitated, then laughed and clapped Tempe roughly on the shoulder. I half expected Tempe to dart away from his touch, but instead the Adem returned the gesture, even to the point of gripping Dedan's shoulder and jostling him around playfully. The display struck me as odd coming from someone who had been so reserved over the last several days, but I decided not to look a gift horse in the mouth. Anything other than fidgety silence from the Adem was a blessing. Even better, I now had a measure of Tempe's fighting ability. Whether or not Dedan wanted to admit it, Tempe obviously had the better of him. I guess the Adem reputation was more than just empty air. Martin watched Tempe return to his seat. "Those clothes are still a problem," the woodsman said, as if nothing much had happened.
What the fuck
He eyed Tempe's blood-red shirt and pants. "Might as well run around waving a flag as wear that in the trees." "I'll talk with him about it," I told the others. If Tempe was self-conscious about his Aturan, I guessed our conversation would go more smoothly without an audience. "And I'll work out what he'll do if he runs into them. You 3 can go settle in and get dinner started." The 3 of them scattered off, looking to claim the prime places for their bedrolls. Tempe watched them go, then turned back to look at me. He glanced down at the ground and took a small, shuffling step away.
Gimby got shot? He dead?
"Tempe?"
Gimby Rock?
He cocked his head and looked at me. "We need to talk about your clothing."
Did he die?
It happened again as soon as I started to talk. His attention slowly slid away from me, his eyes drifting down and to the side, as if he couldn't be bothered to actually listen, as if he were a sulky child. I don't need to tell you how infuriating it is to try and have a discussion with the person who won't look you in the eye, Still,
Best
I
3
didn't have
games
the
of
luxury
all
of taking
time.
offense or putting off this talk.
Best game.
I'd already delayed this conversation too long.
Gotta say GTA. The
Tempe,
longevity of that game is
I fought the urge to snap my fingers in order to draw his attention back to me. Your clothes are red,
Minecraft,
I said, trying to keep it as
Minecraft has
simple
been
as
along
possible.
for
Easy to
fucking
see.
forever.
Dangerous. He gave no response for a long moment. Then his pale eyes darted up to mine, and he nodded, a simple bob of the head.
Game. It can't be like a franchise. It can't be like
I began to
Mario.
have a horrible
Can't just say,
suspicion
like
that he
Mario or
might
something. It has
not
to be an
actually
individual
understand
game.
what it was we were doing out here in the Eld. Tempe, you know what we are doing out here in the forest?
And for number 3, you gotta say like Apex or like.
Tempe's eyes moved to my rough sketch in the dirt, then back up at me. He shrugged and made a vague gesture with both hands.
God of War was not.
What
not even
is many, but not all?
How many times
At
can you
first,
play
I
through
thought
God
he
of
was
War?
asking some
Like, how long can
strange
you actually play in
philosophical
that game
question.
before you're
Then I
bored?
realized he was
Fucking
asking for a word. I held up my hand and grabbed 2 of my fingers. Some? I grabbed 3 fingers. Most? Tempe watched my hands intently, nodding. Most, he said, fidgeting. I know most. Talk is fast. We are looking for men. His eyes slid away as soon as I started to speak, and I fought the urge to sigh. We are trying to find men. Nod. Yes. Hunt men. He stressed the word. Hunt Visanta. At least he knew why we were here. Red? I reached out and touched the red leather strap that held the fabric of his shirt tight to his body. It was surprisingly soft.
I will not understand it ever.
For hunting. Do you have other clothes?
Who told you that you could
Not red?
No matter what gun you have.
Tempe looked down at his outfit, fidgeting. Then he nodded and went over to his pack and drew out a shirt of plain gray homespun. He held it up for me. For hunting. But not fighting. I wasn't sure what his distinction meant, but I was willing to let it go for now. What will you do if Visanta find you in the forest? I asked. Talk or fight? He seemed to think about it for a moment. Not good at talk, he admitted. Visanta? Fight. I nodded. 1 bandit, fight. 2, talk. He shrugged. Can fight too. Fight and win? He gave another nonchalant shrug and pointed to where Daydan was carefully picking twigs out of the sod. Like
Minecraft.
him,
even though I
3
never played Minecraft,
or 4.
you still got to put it in the top
He held
3.
out his hand, palm up, as
I
if
think I
offering me
prefer
something.
Apex, I would put Apex
If
over
3 bandit, I
Fortnite,
fight.
simply because
If 4,
with Fortnite they'd be
I
doing too
try
much every
base
game,
talk. I wait until
don't know
3 night.
Their player base
Then,
they just do too much.
he made an odd, elaborate gesture with both hands.
You could say that about any game.
Fire intense.
Fortnite especially, bro. They just don't.
I relaxed, glad he had followed our earlier discussion.
You have to pick a specific
Yes.
Halo. Like you can't.
Good.
Like,
Thank you.
you can't just say.
The 5 of us had a quiet dinner of soup, bread, and a rather
like,
unimpressive
as much of a
gummy
Halo fan as I
cheese
am,
we'd bought in Crossan.
You can't really say.
Daydan and Hespa bickered in a friendly way, and I speculated with Martin about what sort of weather we might expect over the next few
I'm a
days.
Halo fan. Don't get me wrong, but
Other than that, there wasn't much chatter. 2 of us had already come to blows. We'd come 100 miles since Severin, and we were all aware of the grim work ahead of us.
Do that shit once and you're done.
Hold on, Martin said. What if they catch you?
Yeah, bro, GTA 5 has been
He
out
looked
for,
up
like,
at me.
forever, and
We
it's
all have a
still
plan if the bandits
a
find
very
us.
popular game.
We head back with them, and you'll track us down on the 3rd day. I nodded. And don't forget the distraction. Martin looked anxious.
There's nothing that you can say.
But what if they catch you? I don't have any magic. I can't guarantee I'll be able to track them down by that 3rd night. Probably, sure, but tracking isn't a certain thing. I'm just a harmless musician, I reassured him. I got in some trouble with the Baronet Banbride's niece and thought it would be best if I legged it into the forest for a while. I grinned. They might rob me, but as I don't have much, they'll probably just let me go. I'm a persuasive fellow, and I don't look like much of a threat. Daydan muttered something under his breath I was glad I couldn't hear. But what if? Hesper pressed. Martin's got a point. What if they take you back with them? That was something I hadn't figured out yet, but rather than end the evening on a sour note, I smiled my most confident smile. If they take me back to their camp, I should be able to kill them off myself without much trouble. I shrugged with exaggerated nonchalance. I'll meet you back at camp after the job is done. I thumped the ground beside me, grinning. I had intended it as a joke. Sure, Martin at least would chuckle at my flippant response. But I'd underestimated how deep Vintic superstition tends to run, and my comment was met with an uncomfortable silence. There was little conversation after that. We drew lots for the watch, doused the fire, and one by one we drifted off to sleep. Chapter 79. Signs.
I couldn't get high ground enough.
After breakfast, Martin began teaching Tempe and me how to search for the bandits' trail.
Where the fuck are my
Anyone
teammates,
can spot a
man?
piece of torn shirt hanging from a branch or a footprint gouged into the dirt, but those things never happen in real life. They make for convenient plot devices in plays, but really, when have you ever torn your clothing so seriously that you've left a piece of it behind? Never. The people we were hunting were clever, so we couldn't count on them making any obvious mistakes. That meant Martin was the only one among us who had any idea what we were really looking for. Any broken twig, he said. They'll mostly be where things are thick and tangled, waist-high or ankle-high. He gestured as if kicking through thick scrub and pushing things aside with his hands. Seeing the actual break is hard. So look at the leaves instead. He gestured to a nearby bush. What do you see there? Tempe pointed at a lower branch. He wore his plain gray homespun today, and without his mercenary reds, he looked even less imposing. I looked where Tempe was pointing and saw the branch had been snapped, but not badly enough to break off. So, someone has been through here? I asked. Martin shrugged his bow higher up on his shoulder. I was. I did this last night. He looked at us. See how even the leaves that aren't hanging strange are starting to wilt. I nodded. That means someone has been by this way within a day or so. If it's been 2 or 3 days, the leaves will brown out and die. You see both close to each other. He looked at me. It means you have someone moving through the area more than once, days apart. He nodded. Since I'm scouting and keeping an eye out for bandits, you'll be the ones with your noses to the ground. When you find something like this, call me. Call? Tempe cupped his hands around his mouth and turned his head in different directions. He made a wide gesture to the surrounding trees and put his hand to his ear, pretending to listen. Martin frowned. You're right. You can't just go shouting for me. He rubbed the back of his neck in frustration. Damn. We didn't think this all the way through. I smiled at him. I thought it through, I said, and brought out a rough wooden whistle I'd carved last night. It only had 2 notes, but that was all we needed. I put it to my mouth and blew ta-ta-dee, ta-ta-dee. Martin grinned. That's a Will's widow, isn't it? The pitch is dead on. I nodded. That's what I do. He cleared his throat. Unfortunately, Will's widow is also called a nightjar. He grimaced apologetically. Nightjar, mind you. That'll catch at the ear of any experienced woodman like a fishhook if you go blowing it every time you want me to come take a look at something. I looked down at the whistle. Black hands, I swore. I should have thought of that. It's a good idea, he said. We just need one for a daytime bird. Maybe a gold piper. He whistled 2 notes. That should be simple enough. I'll carve a different one tonight, I said, then reached down for a twig. I snapped it and handed half to Martin. This will do if I need to signal you today. He looked at the stick oddly. How exactly will this help?
Black Ops 3 is a really good game.
When we need your opinion on something we found, I'll do this. I concentrated, muttered a binding, and moved my half of the stick.
That's a really good game.
Martin jumped 2 feet up and 5 feet back, dropping the stick. To his credit, he didn't shout.
You could grind zombies.
What in 10 hells was that? He hissed, wringing his hand. His reaction had startled me, and my own heart was racing. Martin, I'm sorry. It's just a little sympathy. I saw a wrinkle in between his eyebrows and changed my tack.
That shit was insane.
Just a small magic. It's like a bit of magic string I used to tie 2 things together. I imagined Elxadal swallowing his tongue at this description, but pressed ahead. I can tie these things together, so when I tug on mine, I moved to stand over where his half of the twig lay on the ground. I raised my half, and the half on the ground lifted into the air.
You got me there.
My display had the desired effect. Moving together, the 2 twigs looked like the crudest, saddest string puppet in the world. Nothing to be frightened of. It's just like invisible string, except it won't get tangled or caught on anything. How hard will it pull at me? He asked warily. I don't want it yanking me out of a tree when I'm scouting. It's just me on the other end of the string, I said. I'll just jiggle it a bit, like the float on a fishing line. Martin stopped wringing his hand and relaxed a little. Startled me is all, he said. That's my fault, I said. I should have warned you. I picked up the stick, handling it with a deliberate casualness, as if it were nothing more than an ordinary stick.
Prestige Master 1000? I reached Prestige Master, like... Wait, I actually don't think I did reach Prestige Master in multiplayer. I received Prestige Master on... Fuck. On zombies, I think I got like level 900 and something. I didn't get level 1000. That was one thing I didn't reach. I didn't reach that level of nerd. I did not know that this was a full team, by the way. Destiny? Never played it.